So let me get this straight. Fantasy football has already been difficult as hell, and then we're going to get to week 12, and we're not going to have the likes of Bijan Robinson, Breece Hall, James Cook, Chase Brown, or Alvin Kamara. There are a ton of studs on bye right now, which means the top 36 rankings may look a little bit funny. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everyone is doing well out there. As you can see, no, I'm not at home. I'm out in Arizona, helping the family get through some of the issues we're currently dealing with, but the fantasy videos are going to continue, especially in a week like this in week 12. This is like go time in fantasy football. The playoffs are right around the corner, and we're missing a ton of stud running backs. That means some of these other guys are going to have to try to step up in week 12. Can they do it? We're going to dive into the top 36 running backs here for week 12, but first, some of my bigger hits and misses from week 11. Now let's go ahead and start off with the hits first. Saquon Barkley, Kenneth Walker, and Ramondre Stevenson. For Saquon Barkley, I had him as the RB1 coming into the week. He finished, yes, as the RB1. Kenneth Walker, now despite the tough matchup going up against San Francisco, I ranked him up inside the top 15. He then went on to finish as the RB14, then Ramondre Stevenson. I didn't love the matchup last week against Los Angeles, but I didn't want to completely write off Ramondre Stevenson. I ranked him as a low-end RB2, and he finished as the RB18. But I did have some big-time misses as well. J.K. Dobbins, Jonathan Taylor, and Javonte Williams. For J.K. Dobbins, it took a touchdown run late, but I had him ranked as the RB20, and he finished as the RB7. Jonathan Taylor, this is exactly what can happen when Anthony Richardson takes away some rushing touchdowns. I had him ranked way too high in week 11. And then Javonte Williams. So much for Audric Estime taking on a larger role. Javonte Williams got the bulk of the touches in week 11, and I had him ranked way too low because of it. But now we move on to week 12. Let's go ahead and bring up tier 1 for the running back position. And when we do that, we see the likes of Saquon Barkley, Devon Achane, Joe Mixon, Jahmyr Gibbs, Christian McCaffrey, and Derrick Henry. For Saquon Barkley, he's going up against the Los Angeles Rams. And over the last 5 games, he's had 3 games of over 185 total yards. 4 games with multiple touchdowns this season. And can you imagine what his fantasy point total would be if he wasn't out there losing touchdowns to tush pushes? Now he gets a matchup going up against the Rams, and they're easier to throw on than run on, but they do allow over 19 fantasy points per game to the running back position. So once again, Saquon on top at number 1. Devon Achane coming in next, going up against New England, and he's getting dangerously close to bell cow status in Miami. He's just not getting the big plays as frequently this year that we saw last year. However, he's still getting 16 plus touches in 5 straight games, 100 plus total yards in 3 of his last 4, and 4 touchdowns over his last 4 games. Now a matchup going up against New England. They allow the 10th most fantasy points per game to the running back position, so Devon Achane all the way up at number 2. Then we got Joe Mixon going up against Tennessee, and dude has missed 3 games this season and is still the RB5 overall, and has outscored the likes of Jahmyr Gibbs, Kyren Williams, and Breece Hall. Now in this matchup going up against Tennessee, they're a pretty average run defense, averaging right around 20 fantasy points per game allowed to opposing running backs. Then we move down to Jahmyr Gibbs going up against Indianapolis. And he doesn't have a game all year long under 10 fantasy points. What's crazy, though, is over his last 4 games, he's only gone over 12 touches 1 time. Luckily, he's out there averaging over 7 yards per touch. Now a matchup going up against Indianapolis, who allows over 21 fantasy points per game to the running back position. Jahmyr Gibbs stays inside of tier 1. How about Christian McCaffrey going up against Green Bay? Last week, in his 2nd game back, we saw him already go over 20 touches a game. But he also has gone over 100 total yards in both games he's played in this season as well. Now, Green Bay is easier to run on than throw on. They allow over 20 fantasy points per game to the running back position, so Christian McCaffrey right here towards the bottom of tier 1. Then Derrick Henry to round out tier 1. And as we head into week 12, we haven't had a game yet this year that Derrick Henry has played in and not found the end zone. He's only 4 touchdowns away from a new career high. Now he's got a matchup going up against the Los Angeles Chargers, and that's one of the tougher run defenses in the NFL. They allow the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game to the running back position. But this is the king we're talking about, and he produces against everyone, so he remains at the bottom of tier 1. Now, before we dive into tier 2, I gotta shout out today's sponsor, Turtle Beach. And let's be honest with each other. We all have a friend out there whose headset always seems to die at the most inopportune moment. It's the end game. It's between you and one other team, and all of a sudden, little Jimmy is gone, nowhere to be found. Had little Jimmy just had the Turtle Beach Stealth 700 headset and its insane 80-hour battery life, he would have been there to help you clutch up a W. But Turtle Beach doesn't have just amazing headsets. They have every gaming accessory you could ever want, and they're all high quality at prices that don't break the bank. Flight simulators, racing simulators, controllers, keyboards, mice, Turtle Beach has you covered. With Christmas right around the corner, cross off a couple Christmas gifts by heading over to turtlebeach.com. But when you do that, be sure to use promo code headliners at checkout so you can get 10% off your entire order. That's right, that's 10% off your entire order at turtlebeach.com with promo code headliners. All right, let's dive into Tier 2. And that's where we have Kenneth Walker, David Montgomery, James Conner, Josh Jacobs, Jonathan Taylor, Tyrone Tracy, and Kyren Williams. Now for Kenneth Walker, he's going up against Arizona, and he has killed Arizona in 3 of his 4 career games against them. The passing volume, though, it's been down here a little bit as of late. However, he's scoring enough touchdowns to make up for it. Arizona does allow the 8th most fantasy points per game to the running back position, so Kenneth Walker right here at the top of Tier 2. Then we got David Montgomery going up against Indianapolis, the current running back 10 overall on the season, and he's back to finding the end zone weekly. When it comes to Detroit and their offense right now, both Monty and Gibbs are weekly top 12 plays at the position. Indianapolis does allow the 13th most fantasy points per game to the running back position, so you better believe David Montgomery going to be up inside Tier 2 this week. How about James Conner going up against Seattle? He's coming off the bye week, and he's had at least 100 total yards or a touchdown in 8 of his 10 games this season. Now, he absolutely crushed Seattle in their last meeting, where he had over 200 total yards and a touchdown in that game. Seattle, they allow the 11th most fantasy points per game to running backs this year, so James Conner's up inside Tier 2. Then we got Josh Jacobs going up against San Francisco. And he hasn't had a game with less than 90 total yards or a touchdown since week 4. He's the current running back 14 overall, averaging 14 fantasy points per game, and now he has a matchup going up against San Francisco, who is slightly easier to run on than throw on. They allow just over 20 fantasy points per game to running backs. Then we move down to Jonathan Taylor going up against Detroit. And you just gotta love it when JT loses touchdown opportunities to Anthony Richardson. Says no one ever. But it is what it is, and it's bound to happen. Jonathan Taylor still has at least 100 total yards in 5 of the 8 games this season, but this week, is not going to be an easy one. Detroit allows the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to the running back position. And if Anthony Richardson were to vulture a touchdown here in week 12, Jonathan Taylor could be in for some trouble. How about Tyrone Tracy going up against Tampa Bay? He's coming off the bye week. New York has gone from Daniel Jones to Tommy DeVito, so you have to expect some reliancy on the run game in this game. Tracy has had at least 17 touches in 5 of his last 6 contests, and Tampa Bay allows the 6th most fantasy points per game to the running back position. Then we finish out Tier 2 with Kyren Williams going up against Philadelphia. And where have all the Kyren TDs gone? After going like 15 straight games with a touchdown, he's now gone 3 straight without one. He's also had less than 100 total yards in 4 of his last 5 games played, and now he has to worry about a matchup going up against Philadelphia, who allows the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to the running back position. Which will then get us through Tier 2. Let's move down to Tier 3, where we see Brian Robinson Jr., Kareem Hunt, Ramondre Stevenson, Aaron Jones, Chuba Hubbard, DeAndre Swift, and J.K. Dobbins. Now for Brian Robinson, the efficiency has dipped here as of late, barely averaging over 4 yards per touch over his last 4 games, but he does have touchdowns in all but 2 games this year. Now he has a matchup going up against Dallas, who allows the 3rd most fantasy points per game to the running back position, so he's right here at the top of Tier 3. After him, we see Kareem Hunt going up against Carolina, and the Isaiah Pacheco return is looming, but I don't just see them completely going away from Kareem Hunt altogether right off the bat. If I was a gambling man, I would bet on Kansas City, slowly bringing Isaiah Pacheco along. There's no reason to rush him back to huge volume. Kareem Hunt has been doing just fine, and now they have a matchup going up against Carolina, who allows the most fantasy points per game to the running back position. If I had to guess, we have another good week of Kareem Hunt here in week 12. Now after him, we see Ramondre Stevenson going up against Miami, and the volume is great, but the touchdowns are sporadic, and he hasn't had over 100 total yards in a game since week 1. This is more of a play for volume and just hope for a touchdown, because Miami does allow the 9th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Then we see Aaron Jones going up against Chicago, and we know he hasn't been 100% healthy, but losing weekly touches to Cam Akers just absolutely sucks. Jones has only gone over 100 total yards in 2 of his last 6 games played. Now they have a matchup going up against Chicago, who is easier to run on than throw on. They do allow right around 21 fantasy points per game. Then we got Chuba Hubbard going up against Kansas City. He's coming off the bye week, and he's continued to perform even when a lot of people, myself included, didn't think that he could. But now we know that Jonathan Brooks is scheduled to make his debut here in Week 12. Plus, this is one of the toughest, this is the toughest matchup for all running backs going up against Kansas City, because they allow the fewest fantasy points per game to the running back position out of all the teams in the NFL, so Chuba Hubbard down here at 18. Then we have DeAndre Swift going up against Minnesota, and he's the current running back 17 overall as of right now, and he's been the most consistent piece of this Chicago offense. He's had at least 10 fantasy points in 6 of his last 7 games, and touchdowns in 5 of his last 7. Now they're going up against Minnesota, though, and this is not an easy matchup. They allow the second fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, so DeAndre Swift is at 19. Then we have J.K. Dobbins at number 20 going up against Baltimore. And as much as I would love to throw J.K. Dobbins up there right around RB 13, 14 or so in this revenge game going up against his former team, it's just not the greatest of matchups. But when you think about J.K. Dobbins here in 2024, you think about a weekly startable running back. The dude has just been bailed out by touchdowns all season. And I say that because he's had less than 70 total yards in 6 of his last 8 games played, and now he's going up against Baltimore, who allows the 8th fewest fantasy points per contest to opposing running backs. It'll be really interesting to see, though, how much usage he gets going up against his former team. Now, after him, we need to bring up tier 4. We see Najee Harris, Bucky Irving, Rachaad White, Tony Pollard, Rico Dowdle, Austin Eckler, Nick Chubb, and Jaylen Warren. Now, for Najee Harris, he's going up against Cleveland. He had a tough matchup last week going up against Baltimore, and another tough one this week going up against Cleveland. And we already know they're way easier to throw on than run on. They allow the 7th fewest fantasy points per game to the running back position. Then we got Bucky Irving and Rachaad White back-to-back going up against the New York Giants. For Bucky Irving, coming off the bye week, remains a solid weekly flex play. Really needs a touchdown, though, to have a good day in this offense. He just hasn't been able to rack up enough yardage weekly. The Giants allow right around the league average when it comes to running backs, right at 20.7 fantasy points per game. But what about Rachaad White? He's really been the more consistent fantasy option when it comes to scoring points. 5+ receptions in 3 of his last 4, and touchdowns in 4 straight ball games. We may not know for sure about Mike Evans just yet, but Rachaad White's still going to be involved heavily in this offense, so he's right here at tier 4, splitting with Bucky Irving. Then we got Tony Pollard going up against Houston, and he's been pretty up and down here as of late, but he should have a little bit more of an opportunity this week with Tajay Spears currently in the concussion protocol. It's really just too bad that this isn't a better matchup. Going up against Houston, they allow the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to the running back position, so Tony Pollard's right here at 24. Then we got Rico Dowdle of the Dallas Cowboys going up against Washington, and I know we have the whole quote-unquote Rico is the lead back stuff going around, but being the lead back on the worst running team in the NFL is just not that impressive. He just needs good matchups. In Washington, they allow the 12th most fantasy points per game to the running back position. Then we got Austin Eckler going up against Dallas, his opponent in that game. Really been a solid flex play here over the last few weeks, even after B-Rob returned last week. Eckler has 3 straight games, though, with at least 90 yards or a touchdown, and just had a season high in targets and receptions. Now the matchup going up against Dallas, they allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game to the running back position. Then we move down to Nick Chubb going up against Pittsburgh, and this Cleveland run game just cannot seem to get going. Good matchups, bad matchups, it doesn't matter. We all want vintage Nick Chubb, but honestly, probably need to start looking forward to 2025. This is not the easiest matchup. They allow the 10th fewest fantasy points per game to the Pittsburgh Steelers, so Nick Chubb down here at 27, and then Jaylen Warren going up against Cleveland. He's consistently getting right around 11 touches per week, but he's really not able to do much with it. He hasn't had a game with over 10 fantasy points all year long. We know that it's a lot easier to throw on Cleveland than run on them because they allow the 7th fewest fantasy points per game to the running back position, so Jaylen Warren down here at the bottom of tier 4. Which brings us to tier 5, and this tier is absolutely disgusting. It's Javonte Williams, Cam Akers, Trey Benson, Amir Abdullah, Jerome Ford, Zach Charbonnet, Audric Estime, and Isaiah Pacheco. And full disclosure, if you have to start any of these running backs here in week 12, I would be absolutely terrified. I mean, Javonte Williams has a good matchup going up against Las Vegas, and Bo Nix has been playing great football, but we can't seem to figure out the running game in Denver. Is it going to be Williams? Is it going to be Estime? We have no idea what's going to happen every single week, and because of that, he's truly boom or bust. Cam Akers, he's going up against Chicago, and he's gotten more work the last couple of weeks with Aaron Jones being banged up, but he's averaging like 1 yard per touch for his career, it seems like, so he needs touchdowns. Now in this matchup going up against Chicago, they're easier to run on than throw on, but he's really fighting for scraps at this point. Same thing kind of for Trey Benson going up against Seattle. Not a bad matchup, but James Conner's going to see the bulk of the touches in that offense. Amir Abdullah going up against Denver. A lot easier to run on Denver than it is to throw on Denver, but due to the injuries to Zamir White and Alexander Madison, Amir Abdullah could see some touches this week. Does that mean that we're absolutely pumped to start him? No, probably not. Jerome Ford, we talked about the struggles in the Cleveland running game. They're going up against Pittsburgh, and Ford's barely touching the football each week. Zach Charbonnet, same thing here going up against Arizona. Not a bad matchup, but Kenneth Walker is going to see at least 80% of the touches in that backfield. We already discussed Denver a little bit earlier here with Javonte Williams. Same thing can be said for Audric Estime, and then Isaiah Pacheco. We don't even know for sure if he's going to play at the time of this recording. It's a great matchup, but I don't see them having to force him back quickly. Work him in slowly. They don't need Isaiah Pacheco to beat the Carolina Panthers. So as you can see, right here in Tier 5, it's a little bit scary. This right here is really what happens when you have so many studs on a bye. All right, so there you have my quick and dirty top 36 running backs for Week 12 fantasy football. Now, every week on average, we have right around 30 running backs that score 10 plus fantasy points in a game. Does that happen in Week 12? If I was a betting man, I would bet the under. But hopefully by this point of the year, you've kind of set yourself up for a good playoff run, and one bad week with a lot of studs gone doesn't absolutely kill your playoff chances. Now, if you enjoyed today's video, do me a favor and hit the like button if you haven't already. And I don't care that the season is 2/3 of the way over. If you're still looking for a fantasy home, hit the subscribe button if you haven't done so. Just come be a part of Headliner Nation. It's a toxic-free community that has a bunch of like-minded people that just want to enjoy the game of fantasy football. But I'm going to go ahead and get out for the day. Hopefully you enjoy the rest of your day, and most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.
Analytics, off the chain, all the channels, not the same. Jake and Kyle, you